We mentioned earlier that you can distinguish between diachronic and synchronic questions, and the diachronic question of personal identity concerns the persistence of a self over time, whereas the synchronic question of personal identity concerns what is it for a thing at a time to be a person. What is it for a thing at a time to be a person? And before we try to answer that question, notice that being a person, at least according to mainstream ways of thinking in the Western traditions, is going to imply, for example, that if you're a person, then you possess certain rights. Not to be deprived of your life, not to be deprived of your freedom, for example. Being a person brings with it certain powers, such as, allegedly, the power to not be abused in a certain way. If you're a person, many would say, it would seem that you've got a right not to be treated as a mere means. Kant would certainly say that. If you're a person, then it would be morally improper for someone to treat you as a mere means as opposed to a means. Likewise, if you're a person, it would seem to be capable of, it would seem to be possible that you could be blameworthy or responsible for the things that you cause. That is to say, a person seems like it's not just got rights, but also with those rights come some burdens. You can be blameworthy, you can be morally responsible for things that you do if you're a person, in a way that, for example, if a puppy is not a person, we're trying to modify its behavior, but we don't blame or hold responsible a puppy for when it has such things as when it has an accident inside the house. We try to modify its behavior, but we don't hold it blameworthy. We don't, for example, resent it for the things that it does, whereas we might do precisely that for someone we take to be a person. And likewise, a person seems to merit both moral protection and moral assessment. Being a person, as I say, has both its positive side and its burdens. It's possible to count as worthy of protection if you're a person, but also moral assessment. That is, we can blame you for doing something improper. We can accuse you of some kind of wrongdoing. So this has implications for our questions such as, if we think that a machine or other primates than our own species, or a newly discovered alien life form, or a fetus, if we think any of these are persons, that's going to have not just practical but also moral consequences for how we treat those individuals. For example, if we think that a fetus is a person, that would seem to imply that therefore the fetus has a right not to have its life deprived of it. Likewise, if we think that a machine could be a person, then if we were to come across such a machine, then it would seem that that machine would, in spite of the fact that it's not made out of flesh, seem to have rights to be treated in a certain way. Take an example from recent archaeology. It's been discovered, I'd say about 5 years ago at this point, that on the Indonesian island of Flores in the Indonesian archipelago, there's evidence that there was a very small hominid, Homo floresiensis, who seem to have lived between 90 and 130,000, let me try it again, 90 and 13,000 years ago. It's on the Indonesian island of Flores, also one of the few islands that still has Komodo dragons. These individuals, the Homo floresiensis, was about a yard tall, and there's archaeological evidence that they used stone tools and that they were able to take down animals in hunting that were much bigger than themselves, which suggests that they could cooperate. Suggests that they were capable of complex, sophisticated, cooperative, concerted efforts, such as is required to take down an animal that's much larger than yourself and perhaps very dangerous. And so, suppose that instead of, this is a fairly remote island where these remains were found, suppose that instead of finding remains, we came across a living group of people that had been undiscovered before, all about 3 feet tall, all able to survive for themselves perfectly fine. They had, let's suppose they've got language, they seem to communicate quite effectively, they seem to be able to hunt effectively, take down animals bigger than themselves, they seem to have culture in the sense that they learn things and pass that new knowledge down to their offspring. These would seem to have a pretty good case for being persons in the moral sense that I was just sketching, in spite of the fact they've got very different body types from the ones that we're used to. Many people might say it would therefore be wrong, even if we had the power to do so, to put these individuals on display in, for example, a zoo. It would be questionable ethically to do so because they count as persons, even if they don't look like us. Well, then the question is, what is it to count as a person in the sense of synchronic identity? Here are some possible answers. One, according to that's consistent with the same soul theory of diachronic identity, you might say it's a matter of having a soul. again, the same problems arise as before. How do we go about answering the question whether an individual has a soul, except for by stipulation, which does not seem very satisfactory? Somebody might say, no, being a person is a matter of having some degree of self-consciousness, some degree of self-awareness, some understanding of yourself as a self. And that is something that Locke remarks on. Locke seems to suggest that idea. And that suggests that higher cognitive skills are what is required to count as having a person. Again, there's no reference in this theory to being made out of a particular type of physical stuff, so that there might be no reason why a machine couldn't count as having self-consciousness and therefore be a person. There's no reason why, in principle, a non-human animal couldn't have self-consciousness and therefore count as a person as well. A third kind of theory might say something like this, that being a person is a matter of having a certain kind of biological nature, such as being a member of the species Homo sapiens. Now, that seems plausible enough to those of us who are members of that same species, but you might wonder, first of all, is it possible to be a member of our biological species without being a person, perhaps because you've lost all cognitive function? If somebody who's born a person ends up in a terrible accident, ends up being in what's known as a vegetative state, some of us might feel that they're not a person anymore, even if they're still a human being. That is, the categories of human being as a biological concept and that of a person as a moral, legal concept might come apart. If that happens, then being a member of our species is not sufficient for being a person. Likewise, it would seem being a member of our species might not be necessary for being a person if you think that a sufficiently sophisticated member of Homo floresiensis or a sufficiently sophisticated machine could count as having the higher cognitive skills that you might look for in personhood, then that's going to suggest that being a member of our species is only a rough approximation to what it is to be a person, but by no means necessary or sufficient. Now, I should also mention that the Homo sapiens theory is going to be one that corresponds, but not being identical to and not implied by the bodily continuity theory. Those two tend to go hand in hand. You might say, well, being a person is a matter of being a member of a Homo sapiens, and now list all the other types of body types an individual could have to count as having being a person. The question then is, how can you specify which body types are necessary and sufficient without giving something that seems arbitrary? And then finally, somebody might say, I give up. Maybe we should go with the Buddhist way, or something that Hume suggested at one point, that maybe being a person at a time is just a matter of stipulation. We as a society just decide where to draw the boundary, where the category of persons ends and the category of non-persons begins, and it's just a matter of stipulation. There's no objective truth that we're discerning. It's kind of like when a couple of people are playing a pickup game of soccer on an open field. They'll just stipulate where the goals are, where the out of bounds are. So too, maybe we as a society can do no better than to stipulate what counts as a person and what does not count as a person. But that seems somehow unsatisfying, if only because when we're trying to decide what to do in cases of potential abortion, when we're trying to decide end-of-life types of questions, when we're trying to decide how should we interact with the machines that are likely to be more and more sophisticated in our future, or how should we respond to the possibility of an encounter with what seems like an intelligent alien life form, it would seem like we would like to do better than just stipulate a yes or no answer, but rather to have reasons. If we're going to look for reasons, then we might be thrown back on one of the earlier theories, either 1, 2, or 3, particularly thinking about 2 and 3 seem like they might be the best candidates for a satisfying theory of diachronic identity.